Welcome, Campfire Crew. Let's get it on. Scary Tales of My Old Childhood Home by Equinox Shift. Over the course of a few days, I've come to remember a number of pretty weird happenings around my old childhood home. I've been able to confirm some with my parents, but my siblings often do not remember. They tend to believe that it may have been a prank by other such siblings, or outright deny it ever happening. It'd probably be wise to explain a little bit about this house. Early in the 90s, my parents moved from their original city to a new city, with my mother pregnant with my younger brother. When shown the home, my parents took note that nothing was out of the ordinary, but the showing was rather brief, and they were also in a little bit of a hurry. They soon decided to rent the house and moved in, and to their dismay, found the basement filled to the brim with markings all over the walls and ceiling and floorboards. The walls had spray-painted Nazi symbolism all over, coupled with what my father describes as odd circles, but my mother confirms as witches' circles or demonic markings, some of them burned into the wood. My mother later confirmed a few Ouija boards etched into the walls as well. They complained, but instead of moving, had the basement cleaned, repainted, fixed, and then continued to stay for the duration of my childhood. The first occurrences happened when I was between the ages of 5 and 9 years old, continuing for the entire 4 years. Roughly every night, I would refuse to go upstairs under any circumstance. I would physically refuse and fight my mother or father, and would often throw a huge fit when they attempted to physically move me upstairs. When finally asked why I was so vehemently refusing to go up there, I outright told my parents, "The girl in the white dress at the top of the stairs says it's not safe yet." The funny thing is, I remember the little girl up until recently. I can't remember her face, but I remember she was about 7 and would tell me to not come upstairs. It wasn't safe. She wouldn't outright speak. She would somehow convey the message while shaking her head. I remember that because it scared me the most when I was a kid. She would look in the direction of my room for a little bit, every so often, and then simply look at me and disappear. That's when I knew it was safe to go upstairs. When I reached the age of 10, this stopped happening altogether. Never saw the girl again, but different, stranger things began to happen. Late one night, in our backyard, someone was murdered, moments before my father came home. Fortunately that night, he decided to come home through the front door instead of the back door. Later, odd meat was thrown in our backyard, and we found our dog smelling at it. My dad brought him in, and the police restricted all access to our backyard for the remainder of the year. We later found out that the victim was shredded to death, and we always assumed that was the meat. Of course, this likely made things worse, as a lot of the blood from that meat was on our property and took a while to clear out. Within the same year, my brother and I had a small area set up for us in the basement to play. Each time we would go down there, we would hear strange whistling. This whistling was very similar to a human whistling a tune while doing busy work, but it was often so eerie. For an entire year, my brother and I were trying to find the source of that whistle, and when we found it, we were terrified. I remember it well. I was turning 11 soon, and we followed it to behind the furnace. There, we found a shadow, similar to a human shadow, cast on the wall. It was tall. It had a hat, no features, just like a normal shadow. It confused us because we didn't understand how a shadow was there, because there was no light behind the furnace. It was dark, but the shadow was somehow darker. Then it looked at us. I use quotes there because physically it couldn't look at us, but we just knew. We knew it was looking at us. Then it whistled. I'll never forget that tune. I'm not sure if anyone knows the tune, but it was the tune used for yodeling Yodel-ay-hee-hoo. Needless to say, we ran upstairs to our mom terrified. She came to check it out, despite us telling her not to, but found nothing. We didn't play in the basement for a week after that. But every so often, we would hear the whistling during the week, and despite us asking our parents if they heard it, they never did. When we went back into the basement to play, at the insistence of our parents as we were getting in the way of cleaning, etc., everything was okay for a little bit. But eventually, the shadow came back. It would always get out attention with the same tune, always trying to convince us to come to touch it, to see it, and neither of us would ever approach it, and we realized it was stuck to the walls, literally. It couldn't go up the stairs, and could only travel along the walls, freely, except for the stairway wall. Side note, I remember telling my mom about this when I was older, and she confirmed that the only wall not covered in symbols was the wall with the stairs, and the stairs themselves. As long as we remained away from the walls, the Shadow Man couldn't get to us, and it eventually resorted to yelling before eventually leaving forever. When I was 12, it never appeared again. However, the basement still continued to have weird events. During the summer of my 12th year, my cousin's brother and I were playing as my parents and other family members cleaned up after a barbecue. As we played, the furnace began to glow bright red on the filter door as if it was being heated by a torch. It had started from the center of the door and grew to encompass the entire door before receding and leaving a bluish-green stain behind. Needless to say, we were all confused. My cousin, who often spent time with his contractor dad, insisted that we take the filter door off and check if it had caught fire. We tried to tell him of the other weird stuff, but he didn't believe it and was convinced the filter burned. Upon taking the door off and inspecting the door, it was pristine on the inside, in its entirety. The door was still the standard silver without any indication of burning, and the filter was its standard whitish gray, clean and new as it was replaced not too long ago. He took the filter off, and there was just a vent below that, a sizable amount of space, and a space to reach the pilot light hatch for the furnace. He put everything back confused. We got our parents, and his dad checked everything out. Save for the door exterior, the furnace was in perfect shape. After this incident, nobody would go in the basement again for a while, unless to store things. At least until I turned 16 and insisted upon no longer sharing a room with my brother. I had forgotten the past and decided to move into the basement. Things started to get a lot more terrifying when I slept in an unfinished basement. Consistent nightmares and weird sightings to the point where I often slept at my friends' houses to simply avoid sleeping in that basement. But I'll share the most terrifying experience that I discovered as my friends ceased to ever stay at my house and insisted upon staying at theirs until we moved. Due to often staying at my friends' houses, their parents began to get a little frustrated that I would never invite them over to my home to stay the night. I often insisted against it, but eventually relented as the perfect opportunity came up, when my friend's parents were away for a week and he was to stay behind with me, at my place. Needless to say, he was delighted, but I was extremely worried. To explain the basement a little bit more, in order to gain some privacy and as my family was not well off, we set up a wall using a bedsheet stapled to the beams of the basement ceiling. These sheets were effectively the walls of my room with a small opening as an entrance. Anyway, everything was fine for the most part of the week, until roughly the 4th day. Around midnight, my friend couldn't get to sleep and decided to try and get some shut-eye in the armchair in the corner of my room, which faced the bedsheet wall. As I was asleep, he awoke in a cold sweat and noticed the bedsheet ruffling a little bit. He noticed what seemed like a handprint on the other side of the sheet pressing against it. Assuming it was my sister who had a crush on him at the time, he jokingly asked the person on the other side to come around. He tells me that the hand moved along the sheet with little giggles towards the edge that was used as an entrance. As it neared the entrance, he expected to see my sister, but nothing appeared. He looked behind the sheet, and there was nothing. Nobody. He didn't sleep the rest of the night, and told me about it the next day. On the 5th day, he got over it, and determined he was dreaming, and again, nighttime came. He again woke up in a cold sweat that night to find a girl in a white dress, about our age, standing beside my side of the bed, just looking at me. He told me she wasn't scary, her face wasn't messed up, but she looked sad when she saw him. She simply looked at him, frowned, and walked towards the exit again. He didn't dare move. He told me that I was having nightmares as she stood over me. He didn't stay the rest of the week. A few months later, we moved, and he always wanted me to stay at his place until that moving date. When he would come over, he never went into the basement, not even to help me move my stuff. I dream about the house every so often. Weird, lucid dreams. I can never really go into the basement in these dreams, and sometimes I can't enter the house. But it always seems different, ethereal. Creepy Classmate by El Alpaca Loco. What you guys need to know, I'm a very, very touchy-feely, sweet type of person, and I would always hold hands with my friends, lay my head on their shoulders, and would give them warm hugs. There's no malice whatsoever, because that's how affectionate I am. This happened during the first major school contest, a school play during our sophomore year in high school. I was assigned as the head of the props committee, and I was given the liberty to choose classmates I wanted to be in the props committee too. Of course, I chose creepy classmate stalker, who I'll refer to as CS, and my friend and savior I'll refer to as L. I chose them to be in the props because I know guys like them wouldn't want to be part of the play. Like I said, I'm a very sweet and affectionate person, and I felt pity that not many of my classmates were talking to CS because he was the odd one out, the class outcast, and it was only L who was talking to him because they were seatmates, but that was it. So I approached him and befriended him to make him feel less lonely. You know, what a good person would do. And along the span of making props, CS and I got close. The worst thing to have happened, sadly. One day when classes were done, I stayed a bit later than usual because I was making sure our rival section wasn't going to sabotage our props. Typical high school rivalry. What do you expect? It was already 6 in the evening when I left the building and was walking to the bus stop. I felt someone walking behind me, so I turned around, and along the crowds of college students, there was CS, leaning on a pole while looking at his phone. This caught me off guard because he usually leaves campus on the east gate, not the main gate where I always go. I just let it slide and thought maybe he was waiting for L or was just hanging around. We have this open area in the campus which is like a park before you reach the main gate. The next day during lunch, I guess I left my bag unzipped because when I got back from the cafeteria, there was a brown paper bag inside which I know I didn't bring. Picking it up, there was a Hershey's chocolate bar inside it and a small note taped on it that says, "You look so pretty today, Alpaca." I really didn't mind the letter because the only thing in my mind is that I got a chocolate bar. Nonetheless, I showed the note to my best friend and Elle, and both of them had different reactions. My best friend, being the hopeless romantic she is, was way beyond happy that I had a secret admirer. Elle, on the other hand, was, for lack of a better word, irked. It happened again the next day, the next week, next 2 weeks, with the messages becoming longer. "Your smile is so cute, and you're so beautiful. You have a cute laugh, and I really like you," that kind of stuff. One day, for some reason, the faculty had an emergency meeting, so that meant an hour without class, and we were talking. Some had their phones out, and my seatmate was sleeping. I was busy doing calligraphy on my journal when I saw a flash of light in my peripheral vision. I looked in the direction where it came from, and I saw CS fiddling at his phone or tablet, which was undoubtedly angled at me. Again, I let this slide. That's when Elle walked by and slipped a paper onto my lap saying, "Look at your phone." So I took my phone from my bag, turned it on, and Elle sent a message. "I have something to tell you later. Be online." That night at home I was waiting for Elle to go online, and when he was, his first message was to avoid CS and stop talking to him. I asked why, and he sent pictures of a phone, a gallery to be exact, and I noticed one album with the title Alpaca. The next photo Elle sent was the contents of the album. It was pictures of me. Pictures from my Facebook, pictures during class, stolen pictures, and some pictures were obviously zoomed in or cropped so that it was only my face in the picture. Obviously, I got creeped out and asked Elle whose phone was that. And lo and behold, it was from C.S.'s phone. Elle further then told me that the paper bag with the Hershey's and messages were from C.S. He knew from the start because of the handwriting, and I got creeped out even more. Elle told me to be safe and to start avoiding C.S. from now on, and I did. The next few days, I gave the paper bag to Elle without getting the Hershey's, and I think C.S. was slowly noticing that I was avoiding him. And this is where the shit hits the fan. Another day of me leaving school at 6 p.m. because of a school seminar, as usual, I was walking to the main gate when I noticed there weren't many students out for some reason, which made the walkway less crowded. The next thing I knew, I felt someone behind me, and there was C.S., failing to hide behind a big bush. My red flag was waving, so I called Elle and told him that C.S. is behind me and hiding behind a bush. Elle frantically told me to walk fast towards the bus stop and stay on the line with him. I tried my best to calm my nerves and walk fast, and I would simply look over my shoulder, and I could see C.S. keeping up and almost 100 feet near me. I think Elle picked it up now, how I gasped and he told me to run. I ran towards the main gate and to the overpass and hid behind a stall selling street food on the sidewalk. A few minutes later, I saw C.S. by the bus stop looking around and was low-key, checking if the students by the bus stop wearing our school uniform was me. I was still on the call with Elle, and I told him C.S. was looking for me by the bus stop. Fortunately, C.S. left and went back to the overpass, but Elle told me I should go to the bus stop on the next block just to make sure. I did get home safely. The following weeks consisted of me avoiding C.S. like the plague, but I felt his stare on the back of my head whenever I looked around the classroom and got a glimpse of him. He would have this straight stare, and it really freaked me out. Elle was kind enough to accompany me by the bus stop, and sometimes he would distract C.S. whenever classes were dismissed. The final straw was when C.S. shoved an envelope inside my bag, and it was 3 yellow pad papers. I didn't get to read it because Elle took it from me, and he read it instead. After reading it, he tore the papers up and threw it out. I asked him what the letter was about, and he told me C.S. thought I loved him because I befriended him and that we were in a relationship and was confused that I was avoiding him. He went on and on that he loved me and that we were the perfect couple. I was dumbfounded. I backtracked to how I befriended him and how I approached him, and I wondered if I led him on, but I know I didn't. I was just being myself. Push came to shove, and I told C.S. that I didn't love him, nor were we ever in a relationship. The rest of the school year went smooth, except for the times C.S. and I were in a group for a project or activity, but I always made sure to keep the conversation short and quick. So, dear creepy classmate, let's not meet again, even at reunions. Monster in the Woods by Ray 223. This happened when I was probably 7 or 8. I was sleeping with my mother in her room because my dad worked night shift, and it was a warm summer night, so we had the windows open. Our house is right next to the woods, and I remember waking up to the piercing scream of what sounded like maybe a bobcat or some other similar animal. My mother and I both bolted upright at the sound, and a second later, my older sister darted into the room and jumped into the bed. Then, we heard why it was screaming. Whatever had a hold of this animal was big, and it was snorting and chewing as the animal it was killing screamed for its life. Now, I've done a lot of reflecting as an adult on this, and it's still a topic that pops up when we're talking about freaky shit. The only way I could describe the sound is similar to a big boar snorting the way that it did. The power behind the snorts made me think it was a bear or something with a massive lung capacity. After about a minute of sitting frozen on the bed, we made our way to the window to peek outside and see if we could catch a glimpse of what the hell was eating this animal. We couldn't see anything in the darkness of the woods, but we could hear clear as day the chomping of the predator and snapping of the bones of the prey. It was just past the tree line, maybe 20 yards away, but it was so loud it could have been directly below the window, and it lasted for a solid 10 minutes. When it finally stopped chewing, that was it. We never heard it walk away. It was like it killed something, ate it, and then disintegrated into thin air. Or stood there watching us. It was silent, and so were we for a long time, just listening to nothing, too afraid to even breathe. It's an eerie feeling when the forest is silent, and you could have heard a pin drop. This thing had to be huge. I cannot stress that enough. A bear we would have heard roaming about the brush afterward. Same for any other larger predator like a mountain lion, and there are no boar in Pennsylvania. It didn't sound like any of those things, though. I mean, I've since seen and heard things like that, and I've never heard any sounds remotely even close to what we heard that night. But that's not even the weirdest part. The next morning we told my dad, and we all went scouring to the area where we heard it took place, just inside the tree line. There wasn't a single twig out of place, no evidence of a scuffle, no prints, no carcass, not even a drop of blood. Absolutely nothing. With the amount of brush and how large this thing sounded, there should have been definitely some kind of remnants of the shit that we heard. But there we were, and there was nothing. So, what the hell? Was it a ghost bear? Bigfoot? A fucking werewolf? I really couldn't tell you, but I never ventured out too far in the woods after that night. Weird shit happens out in the woods at night. A piece of advice: when the forest goes silent, make like a tree and leave. Spirited Workplace by T-Bear Tough. I have seen things for as long as I can remember, and these are some of the things that occurred to me whilst I was working the overnight shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., in an older residential aged care facility on the Gold Coast in Queensland, Australia. For a little background, the building itself is divided into two wings, A and B, with A running straight ahead from the front door through to the back door, and B at a 90-degree angle from the back door left. From the front door left to where it met B wing were a couple of more rooms: the staff room, the main dining room, and a kitchen with an entrance to the laundry, and the visitors' restrooms. A wing is primarily women, and B wing is primarily men. The first account was not long after I started working the overnight shift. I was on with a lady around my own age. We were doing our regular rounds to check on the residents. We had almost finished on A wing, and we were in the second to last room, room 7, when I heard a deep male voice say, "Get out." This was a shared room with a couple of ladies in there, none capable of speech, and the door to the room was closed, as were the windows, and we had done our usual check of the room before closing it up, just in case anyone had wandered through during the night. I looked around where I was, and being unable to see anyone, just shook it off as imagined. 5 minutes later, in the next room, a single room, only one man in this one. Once again, the windows were closed, door closed, no one else present in the room. I heard that same deep male voice say, "Get out," again. This time, my partner looked at me and said, "Get out?" and asked if I had heard this in the previous room. When I told her that I had, she went pale and was in a bit of a rush to get out of that room. Later that morning, around 4 a.m., as I was walking down the corridor past room 7, something or someone grabbed me by the left shoulder and pushed me hard enough that I stumbled about 6 steps in front of me. When I turned to confront whoever had pushed me, there was no one there. Room 7 was an interesting room for these activities. the door would swing itself closed constantly, no matter the weight or size of the object propping it open. And once the door had closed, the sound of things being pushed around the room would be clearly heard. But when the door was opened, all the chairs in the room would be arranged in the center of the room. Several times, and by numerous staff over many years, 2 different women had been seen in that room. One is a woman of average height in an all-white nightgown with long, straight white hair. The other, a shorter woman in a blue nightgown with her hair up in a beehive style. One of the two, the lady in white, is more of the forthcoming and likes to play tricks. While walking past room 7 one night, I looked up at the back door of the facility, a large glass double door, to see the lady in white smiling and waving at me from the other side of the glass. As if I had not been expecting this, I promptly turned around and walked back to where I had come from. It took 5 minutes to calm myself before heading off again. Another night, as I walked into room 7, I headed straight for the secondary light switch so as not to disturb anyone. And this was on the far side of the room next to the room's vanity sink and mirror. I switched on the light, turned around, and the lady in white was maybe 10 centimeters away from me, smiling sweetly. The light flicked, and she vanished. This only occurred once, but after that, I would always wait for the lights to be fully on after that, so as to not receive a shock like that again. As anyone walked into the rooms, the privacy curtains next to the door would always sway with the air movement we made. But one night, as I walked into room 7 and switched on the secondary light, I watched in the mirror as the privacy curtain to the right of the door moved with my disturbance, rising maybe 30 centimeters. That was usual. What wasn't usual was it stopped there for about 3 to 4 seconds and then pulled itself all the way up to head height and stayed there until I spoke, saying that I was not turning around until the curtain was let go. At that point, the curtain dropped and settled. Sometimes we would have what is known as an agency nurse come in to cover a shift when one of the nurses were out sick or the like. At about 5 a.m. one morning whilst on shift with one of these agency nurses, he looked at the monitor displaying the exterior cameras and said, "Who the heck is that?" I looked at the monitor, and the aforementioned lady in the blue gown was standing in the garden, looking around. Strangely, she should have been visible on 3 camera feeds, but was only showing up in one. I went down to the garden where we had seen her, but there was no one there, and I had to turn off the alarm on the back door and unlock it to get outside. Strange. Sometimes, in a few of the rooms, I witnessed beings of pure white and pure black. They were always in groups of 3, and always standing perfectly still watching me. The pure black beings stood out even though they were in dark rooms, and I have never before or since experienced anything like that. But I felt no fear of them, or any emotion at all. I just knew they were there, watching me. We had a resident pass after a long struggle with his disease, and his wife remained with us for about 4 months after his passing herself. Until she left, I would see him almost every night in different locations within the facility, just standing around watching everything that was going on. When she finally passed, I never saw him again. On the nights when I saw him in her room, all the electronics would play up, going off at random times, raising or lowering the volume, and it just wasn't until I said, "Hey, leave her be. She'll go when it's her time. No sooner because you are acting impatiently." After that stopped, and he left her alone while in the room. Not long after I started working for that company, in a short space of time, maybe like 1 week, I had conversations with 3 different residents who had seen a small blonde-haired girl in a red dress. Over the years, I had maybe another 8 to 10 residents discuss the same small girl with me. They described her the same, from the dimples to the plaited hairstyle, her blue eyes, but I never saw her myself. One night, around 2 a.m., I was working with a carer that had to go home sick, and there was a lady who had been very ill whom we were working with, but we knew didn't have very long left. So we checked on her before my partner left, and I returned to my long, tedious paperwork. After I finished, I had about 10 minutes before I had to meet up with the registered nurse on duty, and she would help me assist in completing my rounds, so I stood up to stretch my legs and stood in the lounge area of B Wing. As it turned out, I could see the both front and back doors, and within seconds, I became aware of a figure moving back and forth from the front door to the back, and then back again at incredible speed. When I went to check on the ill lady once again, maybe a minute later, she had passed. Another resident of this facility was close to passing, and this person's passing seemed to attract 5 spirits, or maybe even 6 that I was aware of. 2 of them were quite nasty in nature, scaring a few of the other female residents and appearing to me as dark figures and, like I said, saying rather nasty things about my friends and family. I knew none of that to be true, so I just smiled at them and kept at whatever it was I was doing. And thankfully, after that person passed, those spirits left. At different times during the year, though, I experienced what I can only describe as immense pressure either on my lower back or shoulders. This I attributed to what I could feel as other spirits all piling their energy onto me. One of the other ladies that I worked with is more sensitive to those matters than I am, and on those nights she would feel almost identical pressure in the same places. This pressure would vanish about 500 meters from the door as I drove away at the end of my shift. Another night, as I was doing my paperwork sitting at the desk in B Wing, I felt as though someone was watching me, so using my peripheral vision, I saw a man watching me from the fire door. He was leaning against it and was a little taller than me, dark hair, sort of a medium build. When I looked up to see if I knew him, he moved faster than I could have believed, backing away, and I went looking for him in case it was one of the residents. I could find no one. I still have no explanations for any of this. The Guys on the Duck Hunt by Montana Fowler. This happened during duck season of 2010. Me, G-Tomp, and a few buddies from the college were camping out in a fairly remote area next to a pothole lake for duck and rabbit hunting the next day. The area this lake is in has one very small town about 7 miles away, and as you get to the lake, you have to go over a hill and then drop down to it. So we're camped out, grilling some burgers and kicking back some beers. It gets dark and we settle in to just sit around the fire, bullshitting. 2 of the guys kept drinking beer. The other 3 of us were more thirsty for water, so we stopped drinking. After several hours, now about 1 a.m., me and G-Tomp get the feeling that we're being watched. I mean, we both got the feeling at the same time, and while the other guys were still talking, we both got looking at each other and knew that the other guy was sensing it too. We both turned around and saw a truck blacked out on the hill overlooking the lake with only a dim light on in the cab and several guys inside. Out here, it's still fairly uncommon to see vehicles or people out at night, let alone at 1 a.m. We determined that there's 3 guys in the truck, 2 in the cab and 1 in the bed leaning over the cab. One of us sees the guys passing binoculars back and forth, and we know they're watching us. All of a sudden, we see the light turn off and have a hard time seeing the truck. This concerns the 2 of us. I mean, the other guys are still bullshitting and haven't been paying any attention to us for about 15 minutes. Me and G-Tomp decide that we have to let our buddies know that there's some weird guys watching us, so we get them settled and quietly tell them that we're being watched. We tell them that we doubt it's fish and game or even the police. You just never see those guys out in a remote area like this. At this point, we figured these guys might be scoping us out and planning to rob us, or, hey, kill us. I mean, it's easy to hide a body in 50 miles of nothing. So we get to the dark side of our truck and grab our pistols, shotguns, a 30-30 and an AR-15. We load them up and leave them on the darkened side of the truck and on the bench. While we've been doing this, me and G were able to hear a vehicle very slowly coming down the hill. I mean, no more than idling down. We realize the truck is within 150 yards of our camp now, so we decide that these guys are here for us. We tell our buddies to get into a defensive position at both ends of the truck, and then another to get behind some thick brush off to the edge of our camp and wait. 2 of us stayed sitting near the fire, both armed, but concealing our long guns. We listened and waited, not hearing anything. We know the truck is still near us, because we never heard it go back up the hill. We figure these guys are out there waiting for us to fall asleep to make their move. We decide we're going to find out what they want once and for all, so G-Tomp gets into his truck, and the guy with the AR hops in the bed overlooking the cab. The idea was that if these guys were sneaking up on us, G-Tomp was going to momentarily disorient them and draw their fire. So, the 2 of them go tearing out of the camp at full speed and cut through the sagebrush directly towards where we had heard the truck last. I had grabbed my 30-30 and was making my way along through the brush behind the camp to make sure they weren't sneaking up along the shoreline. We checked the whole area and never found the truck or saw those guys again. They simply vanished without a trace. We now figured that those guys must have had night vision binoculars or goggles and saw that we had some serious firepower with us and decided we weren't a good target for them. I don't know, but that was messed up. Dead Battery by Sunset Sister. We have recently been tasked with moving house. At the moment, we're right in the middle of building our own home, and unfortunately, though we are weeks off of finishing, we've been told our lease won't be continuing and we have to move. In 20 days. We put up an ad on Facebook for a short-term rental and have been lucky enough to find a house with a secure yard for our dogs, enough room for us, and close to my son's new school where he starts next week. So, first things first. We hired a skip bin. We have far too many things and we could almost downsize by half. What can be sold or donated has been set aside and the rest will go in the bin. The skip bin arrives and with it, something else. Over the next 2 days, we filled it to the brim and we were too busy during the day to notice anything off. At night, things just didn't feel right. I told my partner I kept seeing things out of the corner of my eye. I would look around, and there was nothing there. My partner works fly-in, fly-out, FIFO, on 2 weeks away, 1 week home rosters. He flies back to site. That night, I walked out to the front door to put the garbage bins out. I had a rubbish bag in my hand. It was dusk, and the sun had gone down, but there was still some twilight. As I opened the door, I fleetingly saw a dark shadow crouching by the skip bin. I looked down to tie the bag, process what I had seen, and then looked back up. It stood up, walked 2 steps, and then vanished. I stopped walking. The streetlight was on, and it sits to the left of the skip bin. Weird, I thought. I was a little freaked out, but put the bins out and then just went back inside. Later that night, while watching a movie, out of the corner of my eye again, I saw something walk past the theater room window. I looked around, and, of course, there's nothing there. The dogs began to get agitated outside, running up and down the yard, growling. This is very uncharacteristic for them. One of them never barks, and the other is a good guard dog, but mostly a big goofball. The dogs are freaking me out more than anything else, so I brought them inside, and they're kind of my safety net when my partner isn't home. They will not leave the front of the house alone, and watching out the windows and looking at the skip, all night I just saw that they were agitated. I didn't get much sleep. A few days went by, and I was working during the day, and aside from the dogs being agitated at night, I noticed something else. That Saturday came, and I decided to take a trailer load of stuff over to the new house when I picked up the keys. I pulled my SUV out and hitched it up to the trailer. I've driven with the trailer before, but never done it all by myself. I pulled it out from the backyard and backed it into the driveway. I pulled it out from the backyard and backed it into the driveway. I got it on the first go, and I was so chuffed with myself. I loaded it up, tied it down, locked the cage, and was ready to go. I got in, and flat battery. What? I mean, it was fine just a day ago. It was only 6 months old. It wasn't cold out. It was the middle of summer. I hadn't left anything on. There was no reason for it to go dead. Well, no worries, I thought. We have a battery charger. So I hooked it up and let it charge. 30 minutes later, I'm on the road. I parked the trailer and then backed the SUV into the driveway so I could jump in with my car if I had any more trouble. That Sunday, my mom and sister were over to help me pack and do some cleaning. We spent the day doing just that, and then they had to go home. My mom went to start her car in the driveway, and flat battery, totally dead. I got my car out of the garage, jump-started her car, and we talked about how weird it was. My sister got in her car, and flat battery. What the heck was going on? I walked over to the SUV whose battery was perfect that morning when I started it. Now, flat battery. So we now have 3 out of the 4 cars at my house with dead batteries, and I'm at a total loss to comprehend this. I jump-started my sister's car from my car, and she was good to go. My mom left, and I began to back out from my spot directly facing my sister's car. I'm watching her as she begins to back out, and she's looking in the mirror, and suddenly smashes into a lamppost. I heard glass fall from the lamp to the ground. It's difficult to explain how this happened. The look of shock on her face and the fact that she had backed into the lamppost as if it wasn't even there was driving us crazy. I was watching her. I could see out her back window. The lamp could not be seen, yet she hit it in the dead center of her bumper. Totally shocked, we both got out of our cars, and I ran to the back of hers with her in quick tow. No damage. Not even a scratch, and it was a hard hit. We heard the smash and crunch, but there was no damage. I looked at the lamp, dreading the amount of damage that it must have had. But there was not a scratch. There was also no glass on the driveway. Nothing shattered onto the road, but yet we both clearly heard it. My mom's battery was dead after she parked it at home. She got another battery installed, and we had to replace the battery in the SUV as the life was sucked out of it. All were batteries less than a year old that went dead. We have no explanation for that. A few mornings later, I woke up with the indescribable feeling that I was being watched all night long. I got up, went to a little shop in town, and bought some white sage and then smudged the place. I felt better, but it did nothing. First time doing it, maybe. I just didn't do it with enough conviction, I thought. One evening, the dogs were so freaked out that I was starting to get very nervous. They typically tag team when on alert at night, but this night they were asleep in the bedroom with us. We have a border collie and a dingo ex-kelpie. The border collie has a big bark and will go off whenever he hears something. The dingo usually comes and sits with me on the bed as if guarding me, while the border collie always sorts out the business. So, this night, the border collie goes off his nut, barking and whining. And then he started growling. His hair stood up, and he began to bare his teeth. The dingo finally got up on the bed with me and started whining, her hair standing up, and she was also baring her teeth. They were both looking at a spot in the corner of the room. Now, as I mentioned, I've bought white sage essential oils and made up a spray bottle of it, so I went nuts around the room with it, and it seemed to calm things down, just for a little while. But the dogs again went berserk a little later that evening. The skip bin was picked up a few nights later. It made no difference. My partner flew back from site and we moved a few days later, and I'm happy to say that whatever was there did not follow us where we live now. Whether it was that skip bin or not, I don't know. Into the Mine by Jet Youn. It was the first time I went urbexing on my own. I was planning on going to Japan alone for the summer for some urbexing, or haikyo as they call it, but I needed the practice of doing things on my own. I decided to go to a frequently trafficked abandoned mine called Bighorn Mine in California. However, the first time I went, the hiking trail to the mine was dead empty. Parts of the trail had collapsed under rock slides and seemingly disappeared at times. I was afraid I would get lost, and continually checked for footsteps to comfort myself with traces of humanity. I managed to reach some sort of refinery in front of the entrance, and I actually met 2 people there. I was relieved and had some other inner hopes that I might have some company within the mines rather than tackle it alone. Sadly, they didn't know that the mine portal even existed, and left a few minutes after, probably uncomfortable by a 5'3" guy with tactical clothing and a camera strapping a ton of Velcro in the background as they tried to enjoy the view. Becoming alone once again, I treaded on and managed to find the portal behind the refinery. I gazed inside. The graffiti inside didn't help my nervous demeanor. There were signs that said, "Watch your back," and "You're always being watched." And that was all accompanying me along the way. I came across a 2-way intersection. The mine was flooded ankle deep in a stream, and I decided to go with the flow and went downstream. I immediately regretted this, however. The sound of my heart pounding was engulfed by the flowing water, and I decided to head to the opposite direction and go upstream. 100 feet later, I came to a larger cave room which branched off into several tunnels. Not wanting to get lost, I told myself to go left every time so it would be easier to retrace my steps. I entered the first tunnel, and then another, and another, and another. At some point, I stopped hearing the stream flowing. The only sounds were the drips coming from the ceiling and the sloshing of my footsteps. I began to calm down, felt a bit tranquil even, and started to enjoy the odd serenity of this loneliness. As I continued on deeper into the mines, the air began to get a bit dusty, so I took a seat and began putting on a respirator. All of a sudden, I heard a low-toned groaning reverberate around the tunnel, accompanied by a gust of air. It sounded like those battle horns blown by Vikings in the movies, but made by an old man's voice in an attempt to screech. It originated from behind me in the very tunnels that I had just walked from. In that moment, my stupid brain decided to recall every single terrifying memory of monsters related to dark places to basically tell me I was going to die a horrifying death. Ready to piss my pants, I took out my Leatherman knife and stood with trembling knees. I was getting paranoid, having my back against the side of the wall, too afraid to break gaze at either side of me in case I misheard the direction of the sound and this monster could actually come from either side of me. I heard a distant but distinct sloshing from my right, where I had previously traversed. I thought to myself, this is the end. No more Japan. No more haikyos. No more Akihabara. No more waifu pillows. This was no more life. This is it. No point in running. If movies have taught me anything, these punks know their territory like the back of their hands. Or claws. I sat down against the wall and clenched my eyes shut. The sloshing got louder and louder. At one point, I could distinguish the creature's presence at the last turn that I took. It was just around the corner. It was silent for about a minute, and then another. 3 minutes passed. I opened my eyes and gazed at the turn with my bright headlamp highlighting the area. I was met with a, "Hello?" I was even more terrified. Oh no, this thing knows how to mimic human speech. The creature finally took the turn and emerged to face me. I was met with bright lights to my eyes. When my vision refocused, I saw a person. It was an older man. Who was this guy and how did he find me? The psycho was a ghost hunter who had planted sensors throughout the mine in hopes to find proof of the spectrals of the afterlife. Clueless me triggered said sensors as I wandered, which is how he managed to track me down. The groaning noise from earlier? That was him attempting to yodel on his way towards me. Or so he says. I screamed that he scared the living shit out of me, that I thought he was the actual ghost or something. The dude apologized deeply and offered to accompany my flustered butt out of the mine. After vomiting off the side of the refinery, I gave him an awkward goodbye and skedaddled the fuck out of there. In the Road by Peculiar Tendencies. I was 18 years old when this happened, in my senior year of high school. I started dating a girl who lived an hour away in Bogalusa, Louisiana, and would frequently drive out to go see her on the weekends. Bogalusa sits along a river and is surrounded by swamps. In my opinion, it's an area notorious for heavy fog and flooding. It's a rural area, and it wasn't uncommon for someone to hit a deer when traveling to and fro. Being a young driver, my parents would ask that I be home no later than 11 p.m. to avoid this. On this particular day, it rained heavily throughout, and at night it would be a foggy trip back to my home. The first half of the trip was normal. I drove at posted speeds and occasionally slowed down when I saw eyes in the tree line. This contributed to the eerie air surrounding these drives, and I always felt like there was something lurking about and was tempted to gun it out of there. The only way I can describe that feeling is to say that it was an atmosphere of stillness. The lights barely penetrated the fog. The rain had stopped, and the road was abandoned. It was like all life had stopped. Time passed, and halfway through the drive, I had finally reached a small bit of civilization. A Dollar General store left its lights on, and a railroad track weaved through the road, and ahead of me, a car pulled out of a McDonald's drive-thru. The car went pretty slow, which ticked me off because I had to meet curfew, but I stayed behind it in hopes that it would pull off soon. Following down the road, the car and myself left the little town. The path ahead was dark, so I kept a good following distance and tracked the car's taillights. I was exhausted. The car had pushed me past curfew, and tomorrow, Monday, I was going to have school. Dozing off, I rolled down the windows to get some cool air and kept following the car. Minutes passed, and I was getting frustrated. We approached a railroad track that was slightly uphill, and, being in a hurry, I pulled close behind the car I followed. Out of nowhere, the car in front of me jerked and skidded across the pavement. No more than 8 feet in front of me, an emaciated figure was curled onto the tracks. pale white, with patchy bald hair. A man rocked back and forth, clawing at his face. I quickly threw the steering wheel to avoid him and swung my car around him. Maneuvering as best I could, I managed to dodge him and slammed on the brakes once I passed. The car that I was following sped along and out of sight. My heart was racing, and I clicked on my hazards and unbuckled my seatbelt. Jutting myself out of the window, I stared back at what little the flashing lights could illuminate. Silence. Nothing except the ticking of my blinkers. "Hello?" I gently cried out. "Are you all right? Did I hit you?" In the distance, the man slowly postured himself upright and turned his head toward me. He stood there silently, unmoving, and then he let out the most inhuman scream I have ever heard. Breaking into a full sprint, he ran toward my vehicle, so I quickly threw the car into drive and sped off from the scene. No more than a minute later, I found that the people I had been following earlier had decided to pull around and parked on the shoulder. I approached behind them and yelled out the window, "Did you see that?" "Yeah," the driver responded to me. "I'm going back," while he simultaneously called the police. We eventually came back to where the man had been, but there was nothing, just an old railroad. To this day, it's one of the most weird and scary things I have ever had happen to me. I hope I conveyed it well enough, and I'm sorry for all the extra details.